Okay, folks, buckle up because today we're going to dive into a situation that's, well, let's just say it's pretty explosive. Syria regime change. A former Al-Qaeda leader calling the shots now.
Sounds intense.
It is. And it's all coming from a Forbes article by Silati Ture, published today, December 9th, 2024.
Wow, so this is breaking
Ugh,
news.
you probably have a ton of questions.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Like this Abu Mohammed al-Golani guy? What's he want, and what does his rise mean for Syria's future? That's the big one.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to figure out.
It's a tangled web for sure. Al-Golani himself is kind of a paradox, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. This Forbes piece lays out his early life, and it's not what you'd expect at all.
Yeah.
Born in Saudi Arabia to Syrian parents.
Okay.
But get this, they were originally from the Golan Heights.
Oh, wow. So already a point of contention.
Right, and then he's raised in a relatively liberal Damascus neighborhood, not exactly the typical background for a future jihadist leader.
Yeah, that's surprising. What's fascinating is his father was a secular pan-Arabist. He believed in a unified Arab nation free from foreign influence.
Interesting.
And he actually opposed the Ba'ath Party, the very party Assad's family belonged to. He even spent time in jail for his beliefs. Talk about irony.
It's like a Shakespearean drama unfolding. So how does this kid, raised with these values, end up joining Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003? What could possibly push him to that extreme?
That's the question, isn't it? We know he spent 5 years in prison, including time at Abu Ghraib.
Abu Ghraib. That place was notorious.
Exactly. A place known for human rights abuses.
Yeah.
Imagine the impact of that experience. The anger, the resentment, the potential for radicalization. It's like a breeding ground for extremism.
Yeah, it's like pouring fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
So flash forward to 2011, the Syrian civil war breaks out, and boom, al-Golani's back in Syria, leading the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda's affiliate there.
And let me tell you, the Syrian conflict was a mess. So many factions constantly shifting alliances, almost impossible to keep track of.
So maybe help us out here. Initially, al-Golani was allied with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, right? But then they had this huge falling out. Apparently, it was over ideology and strategy. Can you unpack that a little? What were their core differences?
Sure. Think of it this way. Al-Qaeda, while undeniably a terrorist organization, had a more global agenda. They wanted to attack the West topple regimes seen as enemies of Islam, that sort of thing.
Okay.
ISIS, on the other hand, was all about establishing a caliphate right here, right now.
Well,
They were much more focused on brute force and controlling territory.
so al-Golani breaks with ISIS, but then in 2016, he does something even more surprising. Nusra Front becomes Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, publicly cutting ties with al-Qaeda and claiming to focus solely on Syria. What's with all the name changes? Is he just trying to rebrand himself?
Well, it certainly looks that way, doesn't it? It's like he's shedding his old skin, trying to distance himself from his al-Qaeda past. The question is this a genuine change of heart or just a clever PR move?
A Syrian makeover, you might say.
Exactly.
And it doesn't stop there. In 2018, another name change. They're now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS for short,
Right, yes.
aiming for that liberation of Syria vibe.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting. HTS starts consolidating power in Idlib province as the Assad regime weakens. And al-Golani, he starts making moves that seem, well, almost moderate. He dissolves religious police, allows church services, even talks about not forcing Islamic law on anyone. It's a far cry from the al-Golani who once dismissed minority groups and called for strict Islamic rule.
It's almost like he's trying to convince everyone he's a changed man. But is he? Or is this all just a carefully calculated act?
That's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We'll look at his rise to power, analyze his rhetoric, and try to figure out if there's any substance behind this so-called moderation.
Sounds like we have a lot more to uncover. Stay tuned. So we've established that al-Golani has been doing some serious image rehab, trying to soften his look. But it's not just about one man's ambitions here, right? We're talking about a whole movement, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, with its own factions and internal dynamics.
Oh, absolutely. HTS is not this monolithic group. It's more like an umbrella organization
I see.
with all these different groups under it, each with their own ideologies, goals, levels of commitment to al-Golani's vision.
So even if al-Golani genuinely wants to steer Syria towards a more, moderate, inclusive future, and that's a big IF, can he actually bring the rest of HTS along with him?
Right. There've got to be hardliners within the group who oppose any kind of compromise.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like imagine trying to herd cats, except these cats are heavily armed, and have very strong opinions about Islamic law. That's
Gotcha.
kind of what al-Golani's up against.
Yikes. Okay. So he's got internal pressure from within HTS, but then there's the whole international community watching him. They're not exactly throwing him a welcome back party.
No, they're not. The world has seen what extremist groups have done in Syria. There's a lot of mistrust towards anyone associated with al-Qaeda, even if they claim to have renounced their past.
Yeah, it's like trying to convince people you're not a wolf anymore after you've been wearing sheep's clothing for years. But speaking of pronouncements, in that CNN interview last week, al-Golani really tried to distance himself from his earlier statements about wanting strict Islamic rule. He talked about building institutions, making decisions based on consensus, not just religious edicts. He even suggested that HTS might dissolve itself at some point.
Interesting. His rhetoric has definitely shifted. He's using language that appeals to Western audiences, emphasizing democracy and human rights.
Yeah, for sure.
But again, actions speak louder than words. The world is waiting to see evidence of this supposed moderation, not just carefully crafted sound bites.
So what would that evidence look like? What would convince the international community that al-Golani and HTS are serious about this new path?
Well, there are a few key things to watch. First, their treatment of minorities. While they truly uphold the rights and freedoms of Christians, Alawites, Druze, and other groups that were sidelined under Assad.
Right. Syria's got a diverse population. Inclusivity is going to be key for any kind of lasting peace.
Yep. Exactly. Second, their approach to governance. Will they establish a system that's truly inclusive, allows for political dissent, respects the rule of law, or will it just be another authoritarian regime, just with a religious flavor this time?
Good point. And what about their stance on terrorism?
Huge one. Will they actively combat other extremist groups within Syria, or will they turn a blind eye to those who share their ideology? Especially since the U.S. still considers HTS a terrorist organization.
Right. So he's got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Exactly. But let's be real. The situation in Syria is still incredibly volatile. It's like trying to predict which way a leaf will blow in a hurricane.
Okay, so predicting the future is out. But can we at least try to game out some potential scenarios based on what we know about al-Golani, HTS, and the regional power dynamics? Where could things go from here?
Let's start with the optimistic scenario. Al-Golani consolidates his power, establishes a relatively stable government, and gradually gains international acceptance. Maybe sanctions are lifted, HTS is removed from the terrorist list, and Syria starts to rebuild. It's a long shot, I'll admit, but not entirely impossible.
Yeah, that'd be a pretty remarkable turnaround. But I imagine it would take some serious maneuvering on his part.
Oh yeah, he'd need to thread a needle with a sledgehammer to pull that off.
Uh-huh. Okay. Then there's the flip side. What if internal divisions within HTS widen and things start to fracture? Maybe a power struggle between the hardliners and those who support al-Golani's supposed moderation.
Right, and that could create a power vacuum.
Oh, I see. Other actors could swoop in and exploit the chaos.
Exactly. Neighboring countries, outside powers, all with their own agendas. Syria has always been a proxy war battleground, with various regional and international powers meddling in their affairs. A fractured HTS could open the door for even more intervention, leading to even more instability.
Okay, so we've got the optimistic scenario and the potential for internal chaos. What else is on the table?
Well, there's a scenario that keeps a lot of people up at night. What if this whole moderation thing is just a facade, a clever act to lull everyone into a false sense of security? What if al-Golani is playing the long game, biding his time until he has a firm grip on power, and then, bam, he reverts to hardline Islamism?
Okay, now that's a chilling thought, like that saying, beware of Greeks bearing gifts.
Right. We can't rule out the possibility that he's just a very cunning strategist, using tactics to achieve his ultimate goal, an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law.
So how do we know what to believe? It seems like we're stuck in this guessing game, trying to read his tea leaves.
We are, and it's a high-stakes game. The Syrian people have already been through so much, and the wrong move could send the country spiraling back into chaos.
I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this, to be honest. Is there any hope for a positive outcome in Syria after all these years of war and bloodshed?
It's important to acknowledge the challenges, but also important to remember that the Syrian people are incredibly resilient. They haven't given up hope, and neither should we.
So what can ordinary people like us do? It all seems so massive, so far beyond our control.
We may not be policymakers or diplomats, but we're not powerless. We can stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions about Syria, and support humanitarian organizations helping people on the ground.
Like that saying, even a small ripple can create a wave.
Exactly. Every voice raised, every act of compassion, every effort to understand and engage with these issues, it all contributes to a more just and peaceful world. And in a situation as complex and uncertain as Syria's, every bit of hope and effort matters.
We've given our listeners a lot to think about here, but maybe before they get indigestion, we should move on to the last part of our deep dive. Okay, we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into this, well, Al-Golani puzzle.
Yeah, from Al-Qaeda to maybe leading Syria. It's quite the
Here
story.
it is. It's like one of those political thrillers with a crazy plot twist every few minutes. But let's try to pull out some key takeaways for our listeners before we get lost in all the drama.
Good idea.
Oh,
I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't look at Al-Golani or HTS as just black and white, good or bad. Their evolution has been really complex, and their motives are still kind of unclear,
so it's not as easy as saying he's a good guy now or that he's still the bad guy. We need more information.
right? We got to resist jumping to conclusions based on his past actions or any preconceived ideas we might have. Instead, we have to pay attention to what he's actually doing now, his policies, how HTS treats different groups in Syria, and how they interact with the rest of the world.
So basically, critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism are key. What else should we be thinking about?
This is a big one. The situation in Syria is constantly changing. What's true today might be totally different tomorrow. Alliances can shift overnight. Old enemies can become friends. And all sorts of unexpected things could happen that change everything.
It's like trying to build a sandcastle on a windy beach.
Exactly.
Oh.
So we have to stay informed, keep up with what's happening, and be open to changing our understanding as things unfold.
So flexibility and a willingness to learn are important too. I'm sensing a theme here.
Definitely. And this is super important. We can't forget about the people of Syria. After all these years of terrible conflict, they deserve peace, stability, and a chance to rebuild their lives.
Yeah, no matter what happens with Al-Golani or HTS, that's got to be the ultimate goal.
Absolutely. The Syrian people have suffered so much. Their voices, their needs, their dreams, those need to be at the center of any solution moving forward.
We can't forget about the human cost of this conflict.
Right. And hopefully this deep dive has given you the tools to follow what happens next with a more critical and informed perspective. We've explored Al-Golani's past, his transformation, the challenges he's facing, and the possible outcomes for Syria.
We looked at his words, but we emphasized judging him by what he does, not just what he says.
And we talked about the need to stay alert, think critically, and support the Syrian people in their search for peace and a brighter future. It's their country, after all.
Well said. And I always like to leave our listeners with something to think about. So here's a question. If you were Al-Golani facing this huge